presentation. I'm Laura Kling. I'm a director in our digital organization at Sanofi. And today we're going to be sharing a story about recruiting and our tools for sites. I'm here with Ralph Passarella. Here at Sanofi, just a quick introduction about me. I work to bring digital innovation into our clinical trials, to speed up our development, to make it more cost effective, and to improve the value of our assets. Ralph, you want to introduce yourself real quickly?
Absolutely. And I think we can also figure out how to advance the slides in a moment. So I'm Ralph. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Reify Health.
All right, so like I said, my mission at Sanofi is to make our clinical development more efficient, so cheaper and faster. We look at every part of the process, from the design of our trials and the role they play in the broader development program, to the types of data that we're planning to collect, to the operations, the sequence of tasks that have to be done in just the right order by all of the different players to generate and collect that data so we can submit it to regulators. If you're tuning into this talk, then I don't have to tell you that clinical trials are extremely complex to execute. The work takes lots of different stakeholders who need interdependent information from each other all at the same time. And as we've digitized the tools to do that work over the last 15, 20, 25 years, we see the same problem again and again and again. Danny, the systems don't talk to each other. Recruiting is a great part of the process to illustrate this challenge. The sites are responsible for the work of recruiting patients for clinical trials. And they're going to conduct several tasks to get that done, from looking at their internal databases and reviewing charts, to personal interactions with patients who come into their clinic or who get referred from other physicians. They're going to be collecting that information from those various sources and tracking it internally. And they're going to be following up and keeping track of phone calls and outreach. And then on our end, Danny, we, the sponsor at Sanofi, we need to know how their process is going so we can plan. So how do we get that info? We ask them for what we need. We make a template with all the info that we want to know, and then we have our monitor call them or email them until they fill it out and send it back to us. No problem, it's just a little extra work for the site, Danny. That's for one trial with one sponsor. Then for every other trial with us and every other sponsor, it's the same deal. Emailing, calling about those pre-screening logs. So is this no problem, or Danny, is this maybe some problem? It turns into a lot of extra work for the sites. And it's all falling right back onto them. They're not just responsible for the recruiting, but they're also now responsible for reporting on recruiting, which can become almost a full-time job, and it's not a fun one. It's paperwork instead of patient care. It's frustrating and it's time-consuming, and it's also not really helping the site meet their recruitment goals. It's not adding value to them. And Danny, if you don't mind, next slide. Even when we look at the value for us as a sponsor, this is far from optimal. We're adding workload onto our sites, and so that's going to have natural consequences for those sites, both in their efficiency and in how much work they want to do for us in the future on future trials. It's also, though, it's limiting the info that we get. The sites are doing all of this recruiting work up front, and we still have no visibility into it. We only get the outputs of their recruiting reporting, which means that our picture's delayed. It means we've potentially got some errors or we've got an inconsistent picture from site to site. And we're also only seeing the most downstream data points in the recruiting funnel. So we don't know about a prospective subject until they've already consented and they're already in screening and on their way to being enrolled. So if we look at this situation, we've got information silos, we've got asynchronous communication, we've got extra reporting. Maybe there's room for a digital solution. I'll hand things over to Ralph to talk about one potential solution that we at Sanofi are excited to share about.
So like Laura mentioned, I think one of the things we see in the industry so often when sponsors take it upon themselves to try to solve problems, to make things more efficient for them, for sites, a lot of times we end up with solutions that create more work for sites, not less. One of the things that we did at Reify Health, and we've done together in partnership with Sanofi, sort of step back and say, well, how does this industry work? How do different stakeholders work together? And what can we learn from some of the other industries out there, and how technology has been applied in some of the other spaces? and pull that into clinical development to figure out how to use technology to make everyone's life a little bit easier. And so we've taken one way to view our industry is sort of as a two-sided network where one sponsor like Sanofi works with a very large number of sites on a large number of studies. And you have a site that works with a large number of sponsors on a large number of studies. So it's sort of a many-to-many two-sided network. And so we've seen in other industries, some of the companies represented on the slide here, that when you have this two-sided network, if you can figure out how to use technology to bring the two stakeholders onto a common platform and not just kind of help them transact, but actually embed technology into the way that they work together, you can really transform the experience of buying stuff online, of making reservations and going to a restaurant, of getting from point A to point B. And so we've taken inspiration from some of these kind of two-sided network technology platforms. Is that how can we actually do that in our industry? Because when we look at the way sites work today or worked back in the 2015-16 timeframe, every site on the planet has a system where it does its own work across all sponsors. So for a lot of sites, those are Excel spreadsheets, paper. Some sites have clinical trial management software that they use. Those systems are all siloed from Sanofi and from every other sponsor. And so for sites to share information with Sanofi or for Sanofi to actually help sites get their job done, it's actually quite challenging because there isn't kind of compatibility. And so sort of the result is kind of more work for sites and then low visibility for Sanofi and other sponsors with data. And so what we've done at Reify Health and what we've started to scale kind of in partnership with Sanofi here is leverage the StudyTeam platform. We said, well, instead of starting from the perspective of the sponsor, let's actually start from the site's perspective and build technology to help them get their job done. So identifying patients, pre-screening, recruiting, enrolling patients. That's work that every site does somewhere today. And so our first job was to build software that actually helps them do that work better and sort of brings the site workflow online. Because then it becomes really easy for us to share information back with Sanofi to say, here's what's actually going on in the entire recruitment funnel. Here's visibility into all of the patient activity across all of your sites. And it also gives us the ability to take Sanofi's protocol and bring it into the workflow of the site. Because again, we're connecting between the site software and software that Sanofi uses. We're connecting the workflow of kind of the two stakeholders. And so that approach for us has allowed us to actually make it possible for sites to share the information that Sanofi needs and do less work. And so this is a case where technology has actually reduced site burden. The other thing that we've really prioritized together is not forcing new technology on sites that don't want to use new technology. And so Laura is going to talk in a moment about some of the results we've seen. Not every site wants to use StudyTeam, and that's okay. It's not a site's job to want to use this new piece of software that we bring to them. And so we make it optional for sites. If they want to use it, they can, if they think it's going to save them time. And if they don't want to use it, we allow them to keep working the way that they already work. So they can continue to share pre-screening logs sort of the old-fashioned way, share data with Sanofi the way they always have. And then we bring that data into the application that Sanofi uses so that Sanofi's getting all the data. And sites are kind of maintaining their own, their ability to choose what they want to do, how they want to work. And that has been a very foundational step for us because once we've built something that the sites want to use, then we can incrementally improve it to help them more and more to bring the software to more sites. And also make the experience better for Sanofi kind of on top of this really robust foundation where we're not just sort of every new feature is asking sites to do more work. And so I'm going to hand it back to Laura to talk a little bit about what we've seen together when we sort of apply these principles.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Ralph. So as we started to use StudyTeam at Sanofi, at the very beginning, we very much treated it as an experiment. We outlined our problem at the beginning, and when we were looking for a solution, we knew we needed to see two things. There were two main success factors. It had to be useful to the sites, and it had to be useful to us. On the first point, Ralph or Danny, whoever, is it useful to the sites? Well, we've seen a lot of enthusiasm. Most of the time when we make StudyTeam available, sites want to use it. Almost all of the time, once they use it once for one of our trials, they want to keep using it and using it again and again. And something that's been really especially interesting to see, thinking about the network effect and how it can be really powerful once it starts to snowball, more than half of the sites that use StudyTeam for our studies also use it for other sponsors' trials, whether or not those sponsors are asking them to use StudyTeam. And so that's a significant number of sites who are using it for our trials and have decided it's useful enough for their own internal work that they want to keep using it for all their trials, even when there's no one on the sponsor side looking. And so we're very happy if our tools make our sites happy. That's very powerful. But at Sanofi, we also want to make sure those tools are helping our trials run faster or cheaper in a measurable way. So before we decided to scale, we ran experiments where we had some sites in a trial using StudyTeam and others using the default processes, using their internal tracking methods and then our typical pre-screening logs and the calls and the emails. We did this in multiple trials, multiple therapeutic areas, including very, very distinct, from oncology to respiratory, and in multiple continents. And consistently, we saw an effect in ways that make a difference to our development bottom line. We saw StudyTeam helping us meet our enrollment goals faster. Sites who use the tools saw a higher rate of enrollment, rate of patients per month, which is helping us meet our overall targets sooner. And then on the cost side, we also saw potential to reduce the number of sites that enroll 0 patients. So these are sites where we pay the overhead study costs, the setup costs, but we don't get any data for our dossier in exchange. And this may be a way for us to mitigate how many sites end up in that bucket. So looking at the results of our experiments, we saw measurable impacts on both time and costs while making our sites happy. And we're hopeful that the benefits will continue to accrue as the adoption continues. Thanks for listening, and I hope we have time for a couple of questions.
All right. So Sarah is hopefully coming on as well. But yeah, so we do have time for questions from our lovely attendees who are in the chat. Please put any questions you have for Laura and Ralph. And maybe just kick it off. I would love to know any lessons you've learned about working together that you would impart to someone who's trying to do a similar thing, working with a technology group, and that kind of relationship between pharma and technology.
Laura, I'm happy to let you jump in first, and then I'll yeah.
All right. Well, I can say first is really making sure that you're well aligned internally and very fluently able to communicate with the company about what your underlying goals are. And so as you can see, the way that we've structured this conversation, this presentation is around what some of our key KPIs were for the rate of enrollment per month and our number of zero enrollers. Those are things that are not specifically important to our digital team. Those are things that are important to our clinical operations team and to the business goals that they're trying to meet. And so as we structured an intervention, as we talked about innovations, and as we talked about how to measure the success of that, it was so important that everyone on the project had a really clear and consistent idea of what success looked like. And, we ended up having to have lots of debates about how exactly we could measure that and what are the proper ways to isolate the variables and things like that. But having the clear idea of what good looked like that we could all align around as a kind of North Star was critically important.
I think something else we've done really well internally together is focus on, so number one priority here is we need to see the kinds of results we want. We've also done a good job of, I think, soliciting qualitative feedback from both the Sanofi team and from sites. I think you can sort of metric yourself to death sometimes, but I think also like actually hearing what that means to people, like to the research coordinators using the software, and Sanofi has done, I think, a really commendable job of taking that very seriously, in addition to just like collecting it, actually taking it to heart, and using that to spread the word internally. I think a lot of sort of the organic uptake we saw earlier on was kind of word of mouth. Somebody heard a site say at an investigator meeting, hey, we really need to use this. Are you using StudyTeam? And so that was something that was really valuable. The other thing I think we've done effectively together is focus on implementation process as well. So when we turned it on for the first few studies, let's really identify the things that we did that weren't scalable enough or need to be more scalable if we're going to move from a few to a very significant piece of the portfolio, so that we know what to do next. So there isn't this sort of big, scary change management ahead. And I think we did a really good job of thinking through that early on as well.
Definitely. What was the, I guess kind of talking about scaling up and change management, that could be a scary thing, I'm sure, to kind of really go from A to B, especially when A has been working for so long, and for the most part has been working well, if, not fit for our changing way that we do research. But I mean, what was the kind of language or conversations or resources that you were providing to make sure that everyone was really on board, not just on board, but like excited and using it and making use of it?
Yeah. I think that we set the metrics early on to say, here are the metrics that we're going to care about and we're going to revisit. And if we see, anything that is lower or different from what we were hoping to see, we need to, it's not just you look at a number and it's good, or you look at a number and it's bad. You look at a number and you ask why. And so I think, for example, as we were going from the US to the US plus every other country in the world where Sanofi runs clinical trials, there were certain regions or certain particular countries in particular where we were seeing lower uptake, lower engagement, lower utilization by both Sanofi sites and Sanofi team members. And that's a communication gap. That's it's on us to educate them. And so I think we focus not just on getting the data, but also really interrogating the data to understand why aren't they, and then taking action based on that really quickly.
Anything from your perspective, Laura, about what really clicked or what made sense kind of coming from that pharma perspective?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it comes back to really making sure that we could measure the things that we cared about. I mean, and the fact is, at an organization like Sanofi, you're carrying off such a complex endeavor with so many different stakeholders, and especially when it's global, you need people to be able to look from many different values and see and hear a clear, meaningful story. And so that's where really the combination of the metrics and, as Ralph has mentioned, the qualitative feedback round out this story that makes sense no matter which side of the mountain you're on.
I love that. We do have a question from Merle, who is actually one of our previous speakers. Hi, Merle, and thank you for your question. So Merle says, very impressive software and partnership model. How long did it take to develop the software? Did you implement it in stages? And how difficult was it to get sites to try it?
I can maybe speak to the second part, and then Laura, if you want to jump at the first part there. So one of the things that we focused on, this is maybe a little bit agnostic to the work with Sanofi in particular, we certainly did this with Sanofi as well, early on, is create high volume, high learning velocity. And so we focused really heavily on ensuring that we have a consistent flow of information about whether what we're doing is working or not. And so, for example, when we run a study, because StudyTeam is optional for sites, if there are 100 sites in the study, we don't get one data point, right? We get 100 independent pieces of data about whether or not StudyTeam is useful. That sites perceive it as useful, first of all, and then is it useful, and so on. And so something we've done, I think a decent job of is establish a business model and kind of an implementation process where we're getting a lot of information back quickly so that we can iterate quickly. And in clinical trials, that can be really challenging because each study is sort of special. Obviously, it's, to the sponsor, it's incredibly expensive. And so you have to get as much learning as you can from kind of as little substrate as possible. So I would say that would be my comment on the last part of the question. And then maybe, and in terms of software development, I guess I could probably speak to that. And then Laura, you could talk about implementation. So we built an alpha version in end of 2015. We built the real kind of first minimally viable version in 2016, released it in October. So call it 15 months end to end to go from nothing to alpha to a minimally viable version that's in usage.
And then we've been working together, I believe, since 18 or so.
That's right. Yeah.
That sounds right. Yeah. And then as far as implementation, I mean, we absolutely did things in stages because we never ever jump all the way in first. We always do our test and learn, our experimentation first. But I would say, I mean, this has been a very harmonious approach to doing it, I would say, where we have staged the implementation to learn from each stage very much as we go. And so as we've been planning the rollout, we've been making sure that we're, like Ralph said, listening very closely to all of those data points that we get at each turn so that we can really clear the path in front of the rollout so things can go as smoothly as possible, really.
Definitely. And Ralph's, just kind of picking off of something that you said. So you mentioned that it was optional using StudyTeam. So what was that? I mean, maybe you touched upon this, and just to reiterate for anyone who might have missed it earlier, you touched upon it earlier, but what, if it's optional, like who chose it? Why did they choose it? And for those who did it, I mean, was there kind of a lessons learned at the end of this where it was, a comparison of what might have been or what it might have got better or worse? Anything like that you can share with us?
Absolutely. So yeah, so when we first launched the software, the site uptake rate was around 50%. So about half of the sites would choose to use it, about half would opt to kind of do things the old-fashioned way, which is fine. And like I said, I really strongly advocated to our team, look, like our job is to build something useful. Their job is to tell us whether or not they want to use it. That's it, not to actually use it. And I think that we heard back from them early on. Initially, a lot of it was value. Hey, we need more value from the software itself. And so we needed to understand, well, how do we create more value such that they find it worthwhile to kind of take the plunge? Now, over time, the two things we see, the reason sites would opt to continue doing things the way that they were doing without StudyTeam, the change management isn't worth it. So a lot of times if sites have like very sort of well-defined systems and processes in place where they're doing a lot of stuff, the change management is quite high, and that's okay. And so we focused on sort of making it more compatible for them to share, making it easy for those sites to share information even if they're not doing it through our software. And then there's also a kind of a communication gap. So the other reason people opt out is because they don't, this is a new thing for them. It's a new kind of model. And so they actually won't understand it. And so we get some sites will decline before we actually talk to them. And we see that has very little bearing on whether or not they choose to use it after we talk to them. And so there's sort of a messaging and communication gap that we're getting better and better at closing too.
We have a question from Mia Lee, I believe, in the chat. So first they say, really wonderful presentation. What suggestion would you give other tech companies to get sites adopted and engaged?
Build something useful. So I think that when you have software that sponsors can require a site to use, it becomes hard organizationally, I think, to motivate yourself to do the hard work to build functionality, features, workflows that are genuinely useful to sites when you have the stick of the sponsors making you use it. That's not to say you can't. I do think it's really hard. And so one of the things that we've done with our business model is sort of align our own incentives toward building something useful, because sites have the option to not use it. I think that's like the highest level. And then I think we also spent a ton of time really focusing on like the incentives. Like, does this make sense when Sanofi's getting value? Is the site also getting value? And we drove hard at those use cases, and we avoided sort of like zero-sum game type use cases. So people are like, hey, can we use the data for site selection? Maybe, but we don't want to go toward that because we never want a site to feel like, oh, if I use the software, it might make it harder for me to get selected. So we focused on use cases that are obviously sort of win-win when everything is working correctly. So that's like one other maybe salient nugget that is helpful to share.
Laura, anything to add?
I mean, I think one of the reasons that this has been an exciting experience for us is because we've gotten to see the adoption rates and the enthusiasm and the stories that we've gotten both from the words that we hear from the sites, but also from our monitors, that this is just making more sense for everybody. And so really, I would just underscore what Ralph said, that focus on being useful and listen. And that's the recipe for success. Don't build it for its own sake.
Definitely. And I think that comes across a lot, especially at DPHARM. It's the idea of innovation, not just for its own sake, but innovation in service of something greater. You know, it's not enough to build. It's like, it's fun to have a Tesla. Can you drive it? You know? There's a question for Laura from Carrie Swallow. Laura, you mentioned that you've been working with Ralph since 2018. I missed the beginning of the presentation, so forgive me. Did you see a bigger uptake from sites beginning or mid-pandemic?
That's a great question. And I'll be honest that I don't know how the adoption rates changed during the pandemic. Ralph, do you know that off the top of your head? Because I think it's a very interesting question to look at.
Yeah, I think the actual rate has stayed pretty constant. There's a bit of a confounding factor because we also went global, kind of in the with Sanofi. Redefined Sanofi went from a few countries to a very large number of countries, and so there's some confounders in the data. I think what we did see though is sites. The rate at which sites were getting activated slowed down at the beginning, and then picked back up once things kind of normalized and we got to our kind of mid-pandemic workflow together. And so I think the opt-in versus not stayed about constant, but we saw like a slowdown at the beginning as everyone was kind of scrambling and obviously like people were short-staffed and things like that.
I'm curious, did that change the conversations that you were having? I mean, earlier you mentioned the kind of conversation gap, that sometimes it's hard to have these conversations and really emphasize that value. Did that change anything? Were people more, or change people's behaviors? Were they more likely to say, hey, let's try this new thing? Or did it kind of not have that large of a change either way?
Yeah. I think that sites that were already activated on the platform found StudyTeam, and I should say I know have found StudyTeam incredibly valuable during the pandemic, because it makes it easy for them to do a lot of their work in a very secure and remote, kind of from anywhere type manner that can be harder with some of the other tools they might be using. So it kind of enabled them to work remotely and work as a distributed team as well, in a way that was a little bit harder for a lot of sites in their previous kind of with their previous workflows. That's the one. And then from an uptake perspective, I think we definitely have seen and heard sites sort of iterating that this is obviously where we need to go as a site and, you know, as a staff to be able to work in this kind of like distributed and more remote way if we need to.
Definitely. I mean, we're kind of nearing the end of our time. So if you have any questions from our audience, please get them in before we move on from Laura and Ralph, but thanking them for their amazing conversation. But is there anything that has come up? The theme of this year's DPHARM is kind of understanding it and looking at what innovations will we kind of keep afterwards. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that, of what you think, either in your conversations, in your work, or just something that you've witnessed that you really think this is something that serves us and this is something that we'll be keeping forward. Is there anything that kind of popped into your head with that?
Laura, do you want to go first on that?
Well, I'm struck, Ralph, honestly, by what you just said about the flexibility to work from anywhere. And I think that's really one of the big things, especially for an innovation like this that is more on the back end operations side. Like StudyTeam is not for patients to look at, but at the same time, as we look at you know, where work is done and how work is done, clearly it's important for us to be supporting the modern workplace of the future. And so that, I would say, is one of the big themes that is still resonating with me for this particular project.
I think that something that, I guess, something that sticks in my mind is the wonderful segue from the previous panel. I think the importance of engaging patients and physicians from underrepresented backgrounds is something that as a society we felt in during the pandemic with vaccines and antibody treatments and things like that. And I've tried to keep my finger on the pulse of it, at least anecdotally, about how other industries, even other parts of healthcare, are prioritizing these kinds of like diversity related initiatives compared to what I'm seeing in clinical development. And I think I'm really encouraged to see that kind of at all levels in clinical development. Stakeholders are taking it super seriously and are actually following through on kind of key initiatives and commitments. It's something that we've, and this is a separate conversation, but we've put a lot of investment toward kind of playing our unique role with the StudyTeam platform in that, that overall movement. But I do think that I'm optimistic that there will be kind of continued emphasis in engaging people from these sort of traditionally marginalized or underrepresented communities in the clinical trial process. And I think the pandemic, along with other societal events in 2020, did something to surface that for people.
Definitely.
Sorry, I'm a little late to the party. It sounds like you guys solved all of the world's problems in my absence while I was dealing with technology challenges. But I jumped in right at the perfect time. This is one of my favorite topics, and it is interesting. Ralph, you mentioned that other organizations are really starting to prioritize the voice of the patient, and it'll be interesting to see how it transfers into this arena. One of the issues that I often see is that when we're bringing in the voice of the patient, we're bringing in the expert patient, the most vocal patients into the conversation as we're really thinking through what design might look like, what the experience might look like. But when we think about the average person affected by a condition that may not be, sharing, their condition online, or may not want to talk about it openly, we really need to think through how do we reach the harder to reach patients as well, those that might not be as vocal, to ensure that as we're redesigning the future of healthcare and really thinking about how this applies to clinical trials, that we're designing for them. And there's opportunity for both, but it's just really important part of the equation to ensure that we're diversifying the diversity of our voices, right? We're really bringing in those seldomly heard voices to ensure that we're truly, tackling this decades-long issue of health inequity.
I think to maybe tie your point there, Sarah, back to some of what we had talked about around site burden, I find that the same is true. You could sort of copy paste that or like find replace patient with site in what you were saying there, and you would get a lot of the same thing where we end up consistently talking to sites. Often sponsors will talk to sites that have kind of a fundamentally different category of problems than other sites. Not all sites, in the way that not all patients are the same person. Sites are very different from one to the other. Even academic medical centers, like neuro department at MGH is very different from neuro department at Stanford, but then also, clinics and hospitals are very different operations. And I think that we've done a good job together, Sanofi and REAP, I think, of focusing on getting kind of a broad representative sort of swath of site voices and input into what we're doing. But I think that the industry could probably as a whole would be well served to engage some of the quieter sites that aren't as sort of maybe as well known, but who also really contribute to what we're all doing here.
Absolutely, and it's interesting, there are challenges that each site is going to encounter, and I've always thought, wouldn't it be great to also put in place some sort of learning exchange where, instead of each site sort of stumbling upon the same problem, how can we create something where we're learning from the missteps of others, right? They have similar challenges. It just, we don't always have to recreate the wheel when we're tackling the solution.
Shameless plug. We are doing that. It is live.
I did not know that, folks.
That's true. No, but I think your point is well taken, that like 100 research coordinators solve the same problem 100 different times on a given study. It makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense. And so we should make it easy for them to help one another in a kind of a structured way. And I think everyone's going to benefit and save time. And also we can increase quality that way too. Absolutely.
That's fantastic.
We do have another question from Mia Lee. And by the way, that's what's called a scoop, people. What Ralph just dropped. So Mia says, what approaches did you take to make sure value is delivered to sites before building something while sites are very busy? And then she followed up with, to clarify, user interviews are quite common in tech, but for sites, it's quite challenging. Any thoughts on that?
We took a very unorthodox approach. We actually built 3 research sites. Yeah, and then that has since become a very significant part of what we do at Reify Health. So care access research, you can go to careaccess.com and learn. So we have a very large site network that gives us direct access because so we agree that that is incredibly important. And so our approach was to say, well, let's go know as much as we possibly can about how these people work and what challenges they face. I don't know that that's necessarily the solution everybody should employ. It was quite hard, but I think we think it's that important to really understand the problems that coordinators and PIs and so forth face.